Other big news at the Future Freedom Foundation, Sheldon Richman, if you're familiar with him, he is the former editor of the Freeman Magazine at the Foundation for Economic Education, longtime writer for FFF, and he has now come on full-time as vice president and editor at the Future Freedom Foundation. We cannot be more excited. It is a huge addition to FFF, and we look forward to great things from Sheldon. We also have a new website, should be launching any time now, completely revamped with social networking, etc. All of our videos, for instance, from this Economic Liberty Lecture Series, the College Civil Liberties Tour, and others, will be posted there. In the blogs, it's just a wonderful new site, so please check that out. When we have that up, there'll be an announcement. And of course, our old standbys, our flagship Future Freedom, formerly known as Freedom Daily, our monthly journal. There's free samples in the back. If you'd like to sign up for it, you can back there as well. And also our our daily internet newsletter, FFF Daily, is free for the asking. You can sign up for it in the back or just send an email to fff@fff.org with subscribe in the subject line. This is the last lecture for the semester. I'd like to thank Rachel Ellis of the GMU Econ Society for helping put these together, and of course Dan for making tonight possible too. So with that, Rachel will introduce Dan. Rachel, GMU.
Good evening, my name is Rachel Ellis and I'm the president of the GMU Econ Society. The Econ Society is a student organization committed to the personal, professional, and academic development of all students interested in the study of economics. We organize lecture series, discussion sessions, and other interactions between professional economists and students. If you'd like to learn more about the Econ Society, please come speak to me or any of the officers who are sitting up here after the event. This semester, we have already hosted Michael Munger and Steve Horowitz as a part of the Economic Liberty Lecture Series. Tonight, we have Dan Smith, an assistant professor at the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. He received his Ph.D. In economics from George Mason in 2011. Dr. Smith's research primarily focuses on studying the institutions that emerge to foster economic and social cooperation between socially distant or even hostile groups. His dissertation, which won the Don Lavoie Memorial Graduate Study Essay Prize, explored the institutions that emerged to facilitate trade between Christians, Jews, and Muslims in medieval Spain, resulting in a period of relative peace and prosperity. Dr. Smith has also published opinion editorials in such prominent outlets as the Wall Street Journal, the Birmingham News, and the Jefferson City News Tribune, and has been interviewed on numerous radio and television programs across the nation. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the lecture.
Well, I didn't realize I was closing out the speaker series this year, so I'm sorry to disappoint you guys. It's hard to follow Munger and Horowitz, but hopefully we have a very relevant topic for today, at least a topic that I think is pretty relevant. But before I even get into it, I do want to thank the Future Freedom Foundation as well as the Econ Society. This is just a fantastic opportunity for undergrads and grad students. I've benefited from this program as a graduate student here, and I've been at where I went to undergrad. We didn't have a program like this. We didn't have even an econ society, and now I'm at Troy and we're trying to build up from the ground up a whole new program. So I realize how much work goes into creating and institutionalizing an econ society like you have at GMU that everyone wants to aspire to be like. So really get involved in the econ society, stay active. Definitely thank the Future Freedom Foundation for working with you on this. It's just a fantastic opportunity. And also, with this research, I also benefited from a lot of people that I have to thank, too, real quick. The Mercatus Center, after the tornadoes hit, I had done previous disaster recovery research, and I wanted to get in this project. Well, the Mercatus Center provided the institutional knowledge and the resources that allowed me to carry out this project, as well as a lot of graduate students like Rosemary Fike, Tate Watkins, Claire Morgan at Mercatus, Jesse Gastelli, and then my colleague Dan Sutter, and also University of Alabama professor David Beto also helped me out with this research as well. So it's not just my work up here, it's a work of lots of people that were involved at many different levels. So John Stuart Mill, back in 1848, recognized that when a disaster strikes, people recover recover pretty resiliently, especially in a free society. And he's found this to be just an amazing thing about human society. How can people that are completely devastated, they have their homes destroyed, people die, just a path of destruction left in the wake of the storm, and yet you still see people reemerge and rebuild back. But unfortunately, what also happens is that nature's fury can be compounded by man's folly. So if you're restricting entrepreneurship, you're restricting the price mechanism that structures the incentives and the flow of information that goes to entrepreneurs, red tape, bureaucracy, top-down central planning, trying to micromanage every step of the recovery process, you can actually hamper those natural resiliency that emerges after a natural disaster. So in many ways, nature can be compounded by man's folly on top of that, government intrusion and control of the recovery process. Despite that, you still see robust civil society. You see churches and charities, businesses leading recovery efforts wherever there's a natural disaster. And that's what my research is primarily about, is exploring that civil society that emerges and exploring how government can hamper or help that civil society process. And before I get into it, I do want to mention that when I'm talking about rapidity of recovery, after disaster strikes, people move away. They go live somewhere else with family. Maybe they move to another community, go rent a house somewhere else. The longer they're away from that community, the lower is the probability that they're going to return to that community. So a community that has deep cultural heritage, been long-standing in a place, hit by a natural disaster, if it recovers slowly, people aren't going to move back. And that's what this is also about, is that that's why I'm stressing the speed of resiliency. It's important to get businesses back, to reestablish houses. If people don't see that, they'll stay away and they'll never return. So it's like something like New Orleans. There's certainly areas in New Orleans that will probably never be the way they were. So that's lost. So one of the primary things you want to worry about when it comes to natural disaster is allowing civil society, churches, charities, and businesses to take a lead in the recovery process and to recover as resiliently and quickly. Oh, that's the wrong button. So Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. Just once in a lifetime disaster, just the very unlikely stream of events is a very low probability that something like this would ever happen. It happened, and the Mercatus Center knew that a lot of scholars were interested in doing research on exploring the recovery from this natural disaster, exploring the resiliency, looking at how different communities responded, and looking at evaluating government's response to that natural disaster. So after Hurricane Katrina, Mercatus Center stepped up really big, in a big way. For 5 years, they committed to coordinating research, providing resources for research on Hurricane Katrina, and they learned a lot from this research. Through the Mercatus Center, you had Dr. Pete Bedke from GMU. He looked at the economic aspects of the recovery. Emily Shamley Wright looked at the social aspects of recovery, and then Russ Sobel looked at the political aspects of recovery. And anyone interested in disaster recovery, anyone working in the field, any community leaders, government officials that live in communities and disaster-prone areas should look at that research. It's just a tremendous wealth of knowledge on how civil society really helped the areas of New Orleans that responded. And a lot of the areas where it wasn't responding or growing quickly, it was due to nonsensical government intrusion and top-down central planning. They didn't allow the bottom-up process that created New Orleans in the first place to rebuild New Orleans. And I wrote a summary paper with Pete Bedke on this called Private Solutions to Public Disasters, and it kind of goes through and details how the local governments, how the federal government impeded that civil society response in Hurricane Katrina. The only problem with this research is that it's one big disaster. So when you say, well, we learned this lesson from Hurricane Katrina that you don't want to centrally plan after a natural disaster strikes, well, if you're at a small town in Missouri, they're going to well, you can't compare something from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans to where we are in Missouri. You just can't. You can't. They won't listen to you, and and for good reasons. It's very hard. They're two separate instances. Two separate. Every disaster is different and unique in its own aspect where it hits the totality of destruction. So really, when the two tornadoes hit in 2011 in May and June, or excuse me, April and June or May. Joplin and Tuscaloosa really provided an opportunity for us to do a comparative institutional analysis. So you have two very similar tornadoes strike similar-sized towns in a similar way, similar damage. Well, it's an opportunity to go into those towns and see how are these towns going to recover, what's helping the recovery, what's impeding the recovery. And if they take two different approaches, you can learn even more from that. So if anything, just looking at the damage and the size of the storms, Joplin happened after Tuscaloosa. The EF5 in Joplin was more of a severe storm that happened in Tuscaloosa, and there's more fatalities in Joplin. So just looking at the numbers and how the tornadoes happened, initially you would expect that Joplin would be recovering at a slower rate than Tuscaloosa. Well, we started a new political economy center, Manuel H. Johnson Center in Troy, Alabama. So this was only 3 hours away, Tuscaloosa was. And we started hearing rumblings, people complaining that businesses weren't coming back as fast. And we heard from Joplin that they were recovering fast. So immediately we knew that this was something that needed to be studied and that we needed to devote some research to. Now, conventional data sources, when it comes to disaster recovery, they usually don't. Conventional data sources are unreliable in a lot of instances, even outside of a disaster context. But in a post-disaster context, you're talking about very unreliable information. There's a long history of attempts to measure resiliency and recovery in communities. In New Orleans, they used post office mail receipts, but that turned out to not really measure recovery because it was going to FEMA trailers. That's not recovery. Or it's going to the homes and just sitting on the doorstep, even though the home was abandoned. That's not recovery. So it's been very difficult to actually measure resiliency in these communities. And there's also other issues. Like in New Orleans, what they found when they went on the ground is that the difference between 5 inches of flooding and 6 inches of flooding was actually huge. So if you're comparing two communities in New Orleans, and you're like, why are these growing back so differently? Well, if you don't go on the ground and ask questions, you're never going to actually find out what actually caused that difference. And the difference is most electrical outlets are at 6 inches. So if the flooding is 1 inch higher, it's a whole nother ballgame. You got to pay a lot more to rebuild those houses and get that community back online. So things like that, and if you're just looking at the conventional data sources, you really don't capture. So you really need to get on the ground, talk to the business community, talk to the government officials, talk to the charity leaders, and ask what's going on, how are you recovering, what's preventing you from recovering. So I think that's one of the strengths of this research program is that we're combining what conventional data sources we can find with in-depth interviews on the ground. I was on the ground in Joplin and in Tuscaloosa for 2 weeks each, and then I took a third trip to Joplin. In Joplin, it was in September and October of 2011, and then I spent 2 weeks in Tuscaloosa in January and February, and I flew back to Joplin in June. So I've been on the ground, I've conducted a lot of interviews, and really what we wanted to do is, okay, first of all, see, are they actually recovering at different paces? And if so, what's causing that? So the first thing we did is, well, maybe it has to do with civil society. Maybe civil society in Joplin, if Joplin was recovering quicker, maybe it's due to civil society. But what we saw is that we saw a tremendous outpouring of civil society in both Joplin and Tuscaloosa. Churches and charities stepped up. They coordinated volunteers. You're talking about 90,000 volunteers coming into Joplin from all over the world. They even had a guy from Japan. He had come over. Americans had gone over to Japan to help after the tsunami. Well, he flew over, knew no one in Joplin, Missouri, got a bike, and he couldn't get a hotel in Joplin, so he rode 20 miles each day and stayed there for 2 weeks, helping to rebuild. Just amazing outpouring from churches and charities. A lot of churches have disaster teams all set to come in within 24, 48 hours. They were on the ground, tarping up houses that had their roofs destroyed, moving trees out of houses, clearing the roadways. In fact, when the FEMA officials arrived in Joplin, they actually looked at them and said, does everyone in Joplin own a chainsaw? What are we supposed to do? The roads are already clear, and that's what they initially came to do. So just amazing outpouring of civil society from the churches and charities at both the local and the national level. And the churches, they were very important in that they knew the local communities. So these are churches and charities that they're like, well, Bill is an alcoholic. We're not going to give him a lot of resources because we know this problem. In fact, they used something called Charity Tracker, which allowed them to write in, okay, we're giving toilet paper and water to Bill today. He shouldn't need anything for another week. But if then he drives down the road, goes to another charity, and tries to game the system, which they had a huge problem with in both communities, they could say, hey, look, you already got resources. We know you're gaming the system. So they're very effective in channeling those resources to where they're needed to be and in making sure that there wasn't any gaming of the system or people abusing the system. Another thing that the churches and charities did is they brought in all the volunteers. 90,000 volunteers come through Joplin. That's very hard. How are you going to house them? How are you going to shower them? How are you going to feed them? Well, they worked it out. They worked it out through churches and charities, and they made projects. Whenever you came in, they'd sign you in. They say, this is your you'd write down your talents, and then they'd say, well, here's a project that meets your talents. Here's the tools. They'll connect you together. So it's just phenomenal how organized they were. In fact, a lot of these relationships that they had with the churches and charities with each other were existing before the disaster even hit. So they had plans ready. They knew what they were doing. Just a phenomenal outpouring of support from civil society. In-kind donations, people donating a lot of goods. And actually, this is what surprised me. I always thought it was fantastic that people were donating goods after a disaster, donating shirts, appliances, shoes, water. In the ground in both communities, everyone across the board said in-kind donations were the disaster after the disaster. It was actually, they had to manage 28 warehouses in Tuscaloosa, just a small, it's called Tuscaloosa Emergency Services. It's like a small Salvation Army store. They were managing 28 warehouses full of stuff, and a lot of it, when actually the Joplin storm hit, Tuscaloosa shipped it off to Joplin because they didn't want to deal with it. And then Joplin shipped it off when they had the Mississippi floods. They shipped all that stuff off there because they didn't want to, it was just too much. They need volunteers to work on rebuilding. That's what they need to help doing. Just donating the goods actually turned out to just complicate their efforts and resulted in a lot of volunteers' efforts that were very unproductive. And that's actually amazing, support, that's not the right word, for the price system, right? Because here are churches and charities saying that out of the kindness of your heart, people are giving out of the kindness of their heart, but you don't know what to give. So it's telling you how powerful the price system is that the charities are like, no, give us money, and we'll depend on the greedy businesses to determine what we should bring to these communities. The businesses using the price system are far more capable of delivering the goods and services that they were needed in those communities than people just donating out of the kindness of their heart. So that's a big lesson we learned from this, is that if you're going to donate to after a natural disaster, donate money. Don't donate in-kind goods. It ends up complicating the process. There's still, when I was there in Tuscaloosa, almost a year after the disaster, people were offering me water left and right. Like, I have a whole pallet of water in the back of my business. Like, please take some. They're begging me to take it, right? So that occurred in both communities. Another thing, they just coordinated needs and wants in the communities. They brought in donations. A lot of famous people donated privately. Sheryl Crow donated a car. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt donated $500,000, I believe. The charity concerts. You even had Charlie Sheen showed up in Tuscaloosa, and this was during the bad publicity era stage. He actually showed up and volunteered and helped rebuild Tuscaloosa. So after looking at all this, we realized, well, okay, there wasn't a difference between the civil society efforts in both communities. In both communities, they were very vibrant civil society. Well, maybe it's businesses. Maybe the business communities were different, or maybe the business community in one area stepped up quicker or stepped up more than in the other area. Well, what we saw in both communities, again, is that the business communities really stepped up, both the local business community and the national business communities. You had people donating money, like huge amounts. $1 million each was Home Depot, Leggett & Platt, Potash Corp., Tamco, Walmart. Just millions of dollars were pouring in to help these disaster-struck communities. Businesses helped by assisting each other. There's actually in Joplin a dentist who allowed his competitor to come service his customers in his store. You saw all sorts of relationships like that, competitors actually cooperating together to to help service the needs of their customers. You saw a lot of in-kind donations. The in-kind donations by the business community actually turned out to be a lot more effective from what we learned in our research than the in-kind donations by private individuals. And I think this was because the businesses were there in those communities, like the restaurants. They'd go around and feed the volunteers, feed the disaster victims. There's a lot of that. You had the Tide's Loads of Hope. You don't have washer machines if your house is destroyed. Well, they immediately brought in the Tide's Load of Hope trailer. People were able to wash their clothes. You have the Duracell Power Relief Station. It's a big trailer that comes in to power up your phone, and that's huge during a natural disaster because the cell phone towers are down. So your bars run out, your charge runs out very quickly whenever you're texting or calling. Things like Facebook was actually, I wasn't expecting this, but almost every interview, some people said how important Facebook was in helping them coordinate voluntary efforts. Like they're like, well, we need this over here, or we're going to organize today. Especially when traditional modes of communication weren't so reliable. If you could pop on the internet for a few seconds, you could see what was going on and get to where you needed to go. So Facebook played a phenomenal role and really alleviated the suffering in those communities. You had things, especially like Walmart's. They continued paying the Walmart was destroyed in Joplin. They continued paying their employees. They put them up to other nearby stores. The other nearby Walmart started selling like appliances, and this is a mattress trailer. They don't sell mattresses normally. They gave the local manager the power to whatever they needed. He'd have the authority to go out and buy it and provide it for the people of Joplin. The hospital, there's a major hospital in Joplin that was destroyed by the tornado. Their competitor hospital, and I was in several interviews, they said they're fierce competitors. Immediately, as soon as the disaster struck, they transferred victims from one to the other. They opened up a triage center in the lobby of the other hospital. They brought in patients there. And going back to the churches, there's actually a triage center, and they're operating, like doing surgery on people in like a church, like table immediately after. Like those things just emerged spontaneously. And then a major thing, what most people don't think about is how important insurance was in the disaster. No matter what the disaster is, the insurance payments are always going to dwarf the amount of money that charity brings in. In a voluntary contractual society, we need to take measures to minimize risk. In olden days, this was, well, we'll build barns, right? Like if your neighbor's barn burnt down, we'll all get together and we'll go help Joe build his barn back up, right? That was an early form of insurance. But the big problem with that is that what if the whole community is burnt down, right? It doesn't share the risk broadly enough, right? And also, you may not be skilled at barn building. I'm certainly not skilled at barn building. So if I go over to help Joe build up his barn, well, that's not as good as, well, maybe what we should do is I'll pay in a little money, and then we hire someone who actually specializes in barn building to build back the barn. That's what insurance is, right? So that's what you really need, most importantly, it minimizes and actually eradicates the Samaritan's dilemma. Samaritan's dilemma is whenever you're giving out aid, especially, let's say, in New Orleans, a disaster-prone area, they usually get hurricanes along the coast. Well, if government subsidizes insurance in those areas and government bails them out repeatedly after every disaster, is that going to change your behavior at all? Are people going to move away from disaster-prone areas? No, right? If you actually are paying insurance premiums that reflect the risk of where you choose to live, well, then you're going to choose where to live based upon that risk. So insurance will alleviate those types of Samaritan dilemma problems that always emerge whenever you have government coming in and bailing out people after a natural disaster. So once again, in both communities, just the businesses really stepped up and really played a fundamental role in the recovery process. All right, so now we're struggling to find the explanation for why is Joplin recovering quicker? And it was recovering quicker. I'll show you the data in a little bit, but just walking around the town, immediately got on the ground in Joplin. Walgreens opened 6 months. It's the fastest store ever opened in their history. Chick-fil-A opened, I think it was 7 months, but not only did they reopen, but they also expanded. Walmart was open in 6 months as well, and Home Depot, immediately they started the executive team, I forget if it's a CEO or CFO, was immediately on the ground in Joplin the night the disaster struck. He promised that he would rebuild. and they made a tent, a huge tent Home Depot store outside while they rebuilt, so they could still bring building supplies into that community. And what was really important is that all these organizations said immediately after the disaster, we are rebuilding. There's no doubt that we are coming back, and that's important, right? So if your whole neighborhood was destroyed, and you're like, well, now land values are really cheap. Is going to be like cheap college kid rental housing in this neighborhood? I don't want to live there. Sorry. But you don't. The dynamic of the neighborhood might change if all the people don't move back, right? So you're scared of that, and also, well, what if my employer is no longer there? Is he going to build back? Am I going to be able to get Chick-fil-A? That's going to change my quality of life. Well, there were, you guys laugh at that, but there's literally people that had countdowns to the Chick-fil-A opening. Like people were, because it's like psychological. It's how do you return to normalcy after a natural disaster? You want, like, if someone came into your house and knocked everything around, how do you feel normal and secure again? Well, you put it back to how it was. That's a first response, and that's what these communities want to do, is let's rebuild, get things back. That's how you return to normal after such a disaster like that, and the businesses played a strong role in that. Well, in Tuscaloosa, and I promise you these aren't just cherry-picked photos, nothing was rebuilt, even though we were there several months after we were in Joplin, and the disaster was less severe. We saw a lot of signs. These are a lot of signs of, hey, we're moving to Northport, which is a community across the river in Tuscaloosa, from Tuscaloosa. I saw that several areas. I think overall, the last time I checked, is like 14, 15 major businesses have moved out of Tuscaloosa and moved to Northport. This is over here, you can't really tell what it is, but it's where the McDonald's was. And even a year later, McDonald's was not rebuilt. And that's because in order to rebuild, and I'll get into this in a little bit, the city mandated that they buy extra space for parking spaces. And they changed the square footage of greenery in front of the McDonald's. So you had a business owner that not only had his business destroyed, his livelihood destroyed, but now he has to buy additional land and make arrangements to expand. That's very difficult in this type of context to carry out. Now for the data to actually show that my pictures weren't cherry-picked. In Joplin, and this was, and make sure to look at the date, that's September 1st, 2011, 69% of the destroyed businesses reported being open, in the process of reopening, or open in a temporary location. At 5/15, that's almost a year after the Tuscaloosa tornado, only 15% of destroyed businesses had received construction permits. Now, the city has disputed this claim because they include several churches as businesses, government-subsidized housing as a business, and also like a government-subsidized retirement community. And I counted those each as one, actually, but they counted each building in the apartment complex as a different building permit. So the numbers clearly weren't reflecting actual business recovery. And just for comparison, since people always ask, New Orleans, I found a study 10 months out after Hurricane Katrina. They reported that 39% of the businesses had reported being open at that time. So these are stark differences in numbers and in just the general mentality in those communities. Everyone that we interviewed in Tuscaloosa was expressing concerns about the pace of recovery. In Joplin, they were very happy and pleased. They thought the city was reasonable. What it came down to is they took two different approaches to disaster recovery. Joplin immediately, they said, we want to involve the business community in these decisions. We want to stay out of the recovery process, rebuild back as quickly as possible. Tuscaloosa, on the other hand, decided to take a rebuild Paris approach. They said we need to micromanage every aspect of the recovery. We want to build back Tuscaloosa, make it the Paris of the South. They looked at aesthetics, and one of the big problems with this is that they went through like a voting process for the community input. But the big problem with that is that if you go poll any community after a natural disaster, they're going to want underground utilities. They're going to want swimming pools. They're going to want public works. They want everything to look nice and neat. Well, if they're not paying for that, then they're going to vote for that, and every community is going to want that. Well, the thing is, it's the businesses that are paying, whenever there's delay in any type of rebuilding process, even if it's to beautify the city, it's going to slow down and hurt the businesses the most, right? The businesses are the core of the community, and if any delay that prevents them from getting back to doing what they do, servicing the community, is really going to fall on them the most. So Tuscaloosa, they only had 14% representation of the business community, and that's stretched. There were some retired people that had worked at businesses, and also I think a consultant that was paid by the city of Tuscaloosa. So those numbers are probably actually lower. So they didn't have really strong business representation. What they had is a large city representation on the planning boards, as well as Tuscaloosa is a university town. They had a lot of university officials and university professors, administrators driving the planning process. In Joplin, they had 75% representation of the business community, and that reflected in the size length of their plans. Tuscaloosa's main plan, they had two other ones that went into more specifics, was 128 pages. That's a lot to deal with when after your business has been destroyed, you just want to rebuild back. Already, if you're a long-established business in a community where there were a lot of long-established businesses in the community, you are going to face enough cost just rebuilding back, right? Because you're grandfathered in under previous zoning laws and previous regulations. You got to build back the new ones. So you're already facing a lot of cost, uncertainty, and delay. The last thing you want to do is pile on more regulations on top of that, but that's precisely what Tuscaloosa did in the pursuit of rebuilding Paris. Whereas Joplin, on the other hand, had more of the attitude that Paris gets fed, that this will happen automatically, that we just have to allow the civil society, the churches and charities and businesses to lead the recovery efforts, and that will make the city far more resilient than trying to micromanage every aspect of the recovery process. Oh, one more. And also what you saw is, I have down here, you can't really see it, but there's an ordinance down here. Immediately when we got on the ground in Tuscaloosa, we heard from business communities that there was a moratorium on building immediately after the disaster. Well, we went to the city officials, and they said, no, there's no moratorium. Who told you that? And then we looked at the newspaper, and it said there was a moratorium. And then we looked at another newspaper, and it said there wasn't a moratorium. So we spent many months trying to track down whether there's a moratorium or not. Well, if it takes months for researchers to find out if there's a moratorium or not, I think there's uncertainty in that community, and it's going to make it very difficult for businesses to build back if you don't even know if there's a moratorium, right? Well, it turns out after a FOIA request, ordinance number 7673 has moratorium in the title, and I've interviewed several city officials who told me directly there was no moratorium, but after getting this, there obviously was a moratorium. And they used this moratorium, they expanded, there's a list of 14 businesses, tattoo parlors, automotive companies, wholesale companies, tobacco shops, greenhouses that were banned in the downtown area next to the university. They expanded that to the entire disaster zone. So they clearly wanted to make sure that certain industries did not reappear back in those areas because that didn't fit with their comprehensive plan. They also, in order to get the money for carrying out this plan, you need a lot of federal grants. Well, to get a federal grant, you have to build in sustainability, you have to build in encouraging people to eat local, encourage urban farming, all of that written into the Tuscaloosa plan. Especially the walking around. I don't know if any of you have been in Alabama during the summer, but you do not want to live in a society where you're walking down like several blocks to get groceries and carrying them back. It is hot and you get very sweaty. They were making plans that were consistent with what the federal grant, the people evaluated the federal grants wanted, but were inconsistent with the structure and the culture of the community. Essentially, there's a book written, I believe it was in 1964, called The Federal Bulldozer. It criticized urban redevelopment policies that were especially hurting the poor people, because you'd go through and destroy low-income housing that was maybe unsightly. Well, what happens, and then you build back really expensive housing, but what happens to the poor people? You drive them out of the city, right? You need if you go around any college campus, you need low-income housing, otherwise their kids couldn't go to college. There's a lot of kids around Troy, Alabama, who need the cheap rental apartments, even though they may not look very sightly. That's how they can afford to pay for colleges, living in those. Well, that shouldn't happen. Oh, sorry. Well, all right. I think my computer probably froze up. All right, I'll keep going without it, though. Apologize for that. I should have turned off the automatic 15-minute or whatever. Turned it off. Okay, so Tuscaloosa was using the tornado essentially as a federal bulldozer, using it to clean up the city and make it the way they wanted it to appear, rather than the organic way the city had developed. This really represents a threat to liberty, I think, around the world. Whenever a natural disaster strikes, there's people waiting to implement those plans, insert those into their comprehensive planning. There's consulting companies that are known for getting federal grants. They know the buzzwords to use. They know how to structure it. Immediately going to those city officials anytime there's a natural disaster and saying, hey, you need to comprehensively plan this. They completely forget about the organic nature of civil society and their important role in the recovery process. In fact, there's been a long history in America of politicians from Davy Crockett to Woodrow Wilson admitting that the federal government has no constitutional authority to be involved in disaster recovery. And as we've seen increasing federal involvement with disaster recovery, unfortunately, we've seen civil society, the churches and charities, the role of the businesses get crowded out. And we also see increased red tape, increased in politicization of disaster relief as you insert these political agendas into the rebuilding process. In Joplin, on the other hand, the city was very open. In fact, we talked to some business owners that off the record, they said, I could tell you that they built businesses before they even got building permits for them. So they were going out, they were taking initiative. Joplin brought in new city inspectors that allowed them to go through the inspection process easier. They relaxed bidding and contracting requirements. They just did a far superior role from what we heard in our interviews of allowing the churches and charities and businesses to lead the response and recovery efforts rather than trying to manage every aspect of the recovery. The next slide would be lessons learned. And I think there's three general lessons that you can learn from this research on Joplin and Tuscaloosa. And one way to boil it down, one lesson that you can boil it down to. The first is the compensation principle. And whenever if you're gonna allow the community to vote on, let's have a parade every Saturday after natural disaster and big expensive public works, you have to incorporate the full cost of those and make it fall evenly on everyone in that community. If you're voting for a swimming pool and it's going to be like right over where someone's business was, well, if you're not going to pay in taxes the cost of that to transfer that business owner, and it's going to fall entirely on the business owner, you're not going to include those costs in your decision, right? Whereas if you actually understood and saw the cost of taking more time to delay the recovery process to build the streets the way you wanted them to, you could make more informed decisions and you'd make correct decisions, or at least you'd have the opportunity to make better decisions. So if you're going to do that type of stuff, communities need to recognize that business owners already struck by the tornado, they're the backbone of the community. If they don't recover, people won't return to that community. You have to compensate them or give them more representation on the planning boards, because they're the people suffering and paying the largest cost. So number one lesson, I think, is that you have to compensate the business owners that are hurt the most by the disaster, or allow representation on the planning board so that their voice can be heard. In Tuscaloosa, several businesses told me their voice was completely ignored, and oftentimes on purpose. The second lesson that I take away from this Joplin Tuscaloosa research is that communities struck by disaster have to allow the churches and charities and businesses to lead the response and recovery efforts. I've said that several times, and I can't express how important that is. They know the local community. They know how to channel resources to where they're needed the most and most effectively. They're far more equipped than federal bureaucracies in Washington to help these local communities respond. They know the resources and where they're needed far more effectively. The third lesson learned is that you have to sensibly waive licensing, zoning, and regulatory laws. For example, licensing laws. It's not the time after a natural disaster to begin in debates about the number of parking spaces that you have to have, especially when there's one in Tuscaloosa that was a oil change company. Now, if you know oil change companies, you just drive your car through, right? You never park at an oil change company. Yet they were required to have 17 parking spaces at the oil change place to rebuild. Obviously, that's going to drastically increase the cost of doing business. Businesses are already going to make the calculation of how many parking spaces they need. They have the incentive to make sure there's enough parking space for their customers. There's no reason that any government planning authority should be dictating arbitrarily just like, 17. They shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be getting in debates about the square footage of greenery in front of a building. You just need to get these businesses back in business and serving the community in order to respond resiliently. One way, I started out with licensing laws, but I actually talked about zoning laws. But for licensing laws, it helped. Sorry, with PowerPoint, I'm a little out of sync here, but with licensing laws, it's not the time to be protecting in-state competitors, in-state physicians, in-state pharmacists, in-state carpenters, in-state construction workers from out-of-state competition. These laws in normal economic times cause economic harm. Whenever you put up these licensing laws requirements, it creates a cartel monopoly type situation, raises their wages, it decreases the amount of competition for those jobs. Well, if you don't quickly, at the minimum, just reduce those licensing laws during a natural disaster. So you have like a natural disaster reciprocity law where you recognize nurses and physicians from out of state. They can quickly come into that state and help aid in the natural in the natural disaster. That was very important. We heard a lot of stories like that in New Orleans, where to apply for a construction permit in New Orleans, in some places you had to live there for 6 months. So all these construction workers from all over the United States wanted to go down to New Orleans and help start rebuilding. But in order to start rebuilding, they needed to live in the community for 6 months in order to get the permit. Laws like that really hamper the ability to rebuild back a community and rebuild back a community quickly. So I talked about the licensing laws. I talked about the zoning laws. The third major lesson the third part of essentially waiving licensing, zoning, and regulatory laws would be waiving, obviously, regulatory laws. Things like child care ratios, something you wouldn't really think about in a post-disaster context. Child care ratios, like that you have to have one adult for every 6 kids, that can really hurt that community if you don't relax those laws, because everyone wants to go out and volunteer, right? So it makes sense in a disaster situation to relax laws like those. It'd be better just to eliminate those laws entirely. But in a disaster situation in a second-best world, make laws and provisions that those types of laws will be reduced so that people can get out there and start rebuilding their community rather than abiding by pretty nonsensical regulations in a post-disaster context. But all of these lessons can really be boiled down to just one lesson, and I think that is that economic freedom is the best long-term recovery plan. Whenever a natural disaster strikes and you have a vibrant business community, you have a robust civil society, you have dynamic entrepreneurship, those are the societies that are going to respond the quickest. They're going to be the ones that have the churches and charities that are used to playing that role, right? The more government infringes on that process, there's a great book by David Beto called From Mutual Aid to Welfare State. He talks about how as governments became more involved with welfare, you saw a decline of civil society. Instead of knowing your neighbors and working with them and helping them out when they had a stroke of misfortune, government's going to take care of it. Government will send them a check. So he talks about how you saw a decline in civil society in in the terms of welfare, and I think we're seeing the same thing when it comes to natural disaster relief. If you don't have that robust civil society that's used to taking care of those needs, knowing the people in the community and ministering to those needs through both churches and charities, it's going to be really hard in a post-disaster context for them to step up and take that role. So allow those churches and charities to have the economic freedom to work without excessive amounts of red tape, and don't crowd them out with federal disaster money. With the businesses, if they're being strangled with regulations and zoning laws, and a lot of these zoning laws, the current businesses may have even voted for those zoning laws, right? If you're a current established business and you want to hurt your competitors, like someone's thinking of making a pizza shop next to your pizza shop, what do? you want to increase the zoning requirements because you're already grandfathered in. So a lot of these businesses may have, in fact, actually supported these zoning laws, but then a disaster strikes, business destroyed, well, now they have to rebuild back to the current zoning laws, and suddenly they realize how onerous they are, right? The last thing you want to do is pile on more regulations on top of that. Those types of regulations and zoning laws, policies, as I mentioned, create economic harm in good times. In post-disaster contexts, it could mean like the survival of a certain like cultural community. It could mean how much people are suffering if community returns at all. We're really disaster-stricken communities, especially in the context we have Hurricane Sandy recently. Those communities really need to take the Paris gets fed attitude rather than the rebuild Paris. It's not the time to be politicizing the recovery process. It's not the time to forget about the cost of that's going to fall on the business owners. It's the time to embrace the role of the churches, charities, and communities. What's my time at? Is that right about? All right. Well, I'll end there because I wanted to save time for questions. So thank you.
This is for the recording, so just raise your hand if you have any questions, and I'll come around.
My name is David Ratliff. Just a question. The planning document in Tuscaloosa was 128 pages long. The planning document in Joplin was 21 pages long. What was in the 21 pages?
A lot of pictures. The Joplin plan, I read through that. There's largely the Joplin plan, that's a great question. Largely the Joplin plan was recommendations. And I had several city council members say those are just recommendations. We understand that we can't carry out all of these, and it was just a simply advisory role. Where in the Tuscaloosa plan, it was actually a outside consultant came in, wrote the plan, said this is what you have to do, this is what you need to, how you need to word this in order to get federal money. So the far bigger differences in what they were. Now I'm not saying important thing is I'm not saying Joplin was perfect. We certainly talked to business owners that had ran into red tape, certainly ran into problems like they wanted to build certain things and that would delay recovery in certain areas. But to a large extent, they took this more Paris gets fed approach rather than rebuild Paris approach.
Hi, I'm Vipin. I'm a graduate student here. I found your arguments to be very, very convincing. I'm sure many others in this room did too. But what if someone were to come up to you and say, but what about the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe after Second World War? Is that, let's rebuild Paris, London, and, Rotterdam and so on. So it would be great if you could comment on that.
All right, yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. And I'm going to respond by referring you to another book called After War, where he actually talks about the Marshall Plan and how it operated. And I haven't personally studied the Marshall Plan, but I imagine there's a lot of problems that caused in it. Like I said, I haven't done specifically research on it, and that's an interesting topic for a young grad student to start looking at. I think there would be, a broken clock is right twice a day. I'm sure there were projects funded that turned out all right, but what we see wide scale when you look across all of the aid given out to like developing nations or disaster-stricken nations, largely it's been ineffective and actually made things worse. There's a paper called The Curse of Aid. William Easterly has a paper called Can the West Save Africa? And he goes through and talks about how the aid, rather than enabling those local communities and rather than growing the civil society necessary, rather than promoting economic freedom, oftentimes ends up subsidizing dictators and bad government policies. But yeah, that's a great question specifically about the Marshall Plan, but I don't know any specifics to criticize it with my research.
Dan?
Yes.
One of the things about these hurricanes and tornadoes, emergencies and stuff, is they usually have price controls imposed or anti-gouging laws. Did that play a role in this at all?
Yeah, well, what we saw is that there were businesses like Walmart was actually, because so many people believe that price gouging isn't economically sound, that they're actually businesses taking advantage of consumers rather than it just being an outcome of supply and demand. Walmart voluntarily kept prices down. So did Home Depot. They didn't raise their prices, which actually, they were big enough and had enough, they have warehouses all around the nation stocked up with just emergency goods. So they were able to do that as kind of to build rapport with customers, because they realized that the customers leaving them because they raised prices, even if it was a response to supply and demand, that they might lose customers. So they actually didn't raise prices. There's the Attorney General in Joplin was kind of bragging that they were going around the community threatening business owners if they raised their prices too much. We didn't really, I think businesses in both communities from our research were too scared to actually raise their prices, which actually, obviously, if you understand the economic arguments behind it, that you need prices to rise. Like with Hurricane Sandy, a lot of refineries shut down. The supply of oil has seen a shock, so it's gone down. The only way to allocate resources would be to allow the price to go up. And that's going to allow those refineries to pay workers to work overtime to get them back in operational, back to producing and refining oil. You need the price system in order to do that. You need the price system to encourage people not to just fill up their car, even if they don't really need it. There's lots of people that maybe live near the house. Well, if the prices rise, they're still gonna, they may like walk, they may take a bike, may take public transportation, but if the prices don't rise, they may continue on and continue driving their car. So the price system will encourage less consumption where people can voluntarily refrain from it, and encourages more production. So what causes the price to go up in a natural disaster isn't actually businesses, greedy businesses. It's a disaster that caused the shrinkage in the supply of oil, right? The only way to get the prices back to where they should be is to allow the market to work. The market will drive the price back down after a natural disaster. That's a really great question. We really didn't see those types of accusations after Joplin, Tuscaloosa, and the way we've seen them in Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. And I think that's an important issue whenever you do talk about natural disaster that keeps coming up. And politicians on both sides of the aisle keep getting wrong. That's why there's lines out in New Jersey. That's why people are filling up, even if they don't need it, filling up extra gas cans. It's really harming them economically, and it's definitely going to slow down the recovery process for them.
Any more questions?
All right, well, thank you very much.